So thank you for coming to today's inquiry session for the LGBT Plus Commission, where we will be focusing on the issues of LGBT plus hate crime, domestic abuse and sexual violence. But more importantly, some of the solutions and recommendations regarding these issues from across the UK. Much of our audience today come from local policing authorities, local authorities and civil society, and we're very keen to hear your perspectives on how you have approached these issues so that we can better understand the solutions that may be possible. As for the format for this afternoon, the session will be split into two halves. The first will focus on LGBT plus hate crime, on which we will have three panellists, and they are Leni Morris, who is the CEO of Galop, Amy Tapping, who is the co-chair of the National LGBT plus Police Network, and Rob Wilson, the co-founder of Angels of Freedom. The second half of the session will then focus on domestic abuse and sexual violence perpetrated against LGBT plus people. Our panellists for this session will be Nicholas Rogers from the London Assembly, Leni Morris, again, the CEO from Galop, Duncan Craig, the CEO of Survivors Manchester, and Astrid Palmer, who's a senior LGBT plus specialist IDVA from Switchboard. In each half of the session, our panellists will give a brief statement before we proceed to a Q&A. And this will feature some pre-submitted questions from your registration forms and from the Zoom Q&A tab. So please do use the chat function to put in your questions if you'd like those to be answered. After the session, we will be sending out case study forms to all attendees. So if you have any examples of best practice from your organisation addressing LGBT plus hate crime, domestic abuse or sexual violence, or want to discuss any of the issues that were not covered in today's session, we would be very grateful to hear from you. To our panellists, I'd like to request that you keep your opening statements brief because there is, of course, a lot to cover. So we will now move to begin the panel on LGBT plus hate crime, and I'll hand over to our three panellists for their opening statement, starting with you, Leni Morris, CEO of Galop.
Thanks so much, Alison, and hi everyone. Thanks for having me here today. So for those of you who don't know us, Galop is the UK's LGBT plus anti-abuse charity. We're run by the LGBT plus community for the LGBT plus community, and we work with thousands of LGBT plus victims of abuse and violence every year across domestic abuse, sexual violence, hate crime, conversion therapies, forced marriage, so-called honour-based abuse violence, and various other things that sort of happen to LGBT plus people in the UK today. I'm going to focus this bit on hate crime. So Galop's been working with LGBT plus victims of hate crime for decades. We're 40 this year, and we have spent much of that time doing that work. And I'll just give you a little bit of a taster of what hate crime against LGBT plus people in the UK today looks like. So our pre-pandemic polling showed that 1 in 5 people in the UK today still believe that being LGBT plus is immoral. 1 in 10 believe that LGBT plus are a danger to other people. 1 in 5 feel uncomfortable at the idea of having lesbian, gay and bisexual neighbours, and that rises to 1 in 4 would feel uncomfortable with having a trans neighbour. And we have seen year on year a sort of disproportionate rise in the levels of reported hate crime figures that come out every October. Now, we also know from the government's own figures and from our own research that about 90% of anti-LGBT plus hate crime goes unreported in the UK. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic escalated and drove some hate crime against our community, whether that was due to an association of the community with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, whether it was because some people saw the pandemic was a punishment from God for LGBT plus people's existence and identities, whether that was because already hostile neighbours, as I just spoke about, were then locked down in close quarters with people for considerable periods of time. We saw escalation of violence for that, whether that was about social distancing, making same-sex couples more visible in the street, which meant that they were more a same-sex household was much more identifiable and therefore open to attack in public from those who are hostile. We saw a lot of this kind of abuse and violence aimed at the community related to the pandemic over the last 2 years. Now, I think the key thing that I'd like to talk to you about today, and I'm going to try and keep it really short to make sure we've got loads of time for questions, is that support for LGBT plus people in the face of hate crime is really sparse in this country. There are pockets of it, and there is great work being done, but only about 4% of LGBT plus victims of hate crime have access to advocacy, for example, as in the wake of what's happened to them, whereas about over 20% say that they want advocacy. And that 4% is very much concentrated in the few commission services that exist, the biggest one of which being our own service in London. And there are real impacts on that of not having those victim support services. So another piece of research that we did showed that there are severe behavioral, psychological, emotional changes in a person after they've experienced an attack on the basis of their own actual identity. And that includes, really reduced sense of safety, behavioral changes, less going out, less feeling safe in public, all of those things. But what our research shows is that the impact on that for the community is that someone who knows someone who's had a hate crime committed against them, they demonstrate almost exactly the same behavioral changes as the victim themselves. And in fact, someone who knows someone who's been a victim of that hate crime also demonstrates almost those exact same behavioral changes. So the ripple effect of these crimes goes through a whole community. And it's really important for us to recognize that. It's also important for us to recognize that LGBT plus hate crimes are treated as lesser in the eyes of the law. So there is a 2-year uplift for race and religion hate crimes. There is a 6-month uplift for LGBT plus and disability hate crimes. So there is already a sense for our community that actually we're not seen on the same level. The support's not there. The outcomes at a criminal justice level are not there. Prosecution rates are really low. So I would encourage the people listening on the call who are thinking about commissioning, who are thinking about how to address this, to really think about actually what support is needed for the community. And if you're looking at sort of driving people coming forward to address that sort of 90% unreported, we know that specialist blind force services like our own really drive that ability for the community to come forward and talk about what's happened to them in a way that they do not feel comfortable about coming forward to, say, the police or general services. So there are ways to address this, but they do require sort of work directly with the community and through specialist organisations and providing that kind of support. So I'm going to shut up there, and I'm going to hand over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Amy.
There we go. Right. I'm Amy Tapping. I'm co-chair of the National Police LGBT Network with my colleague Lee Broadstock from GMP Police. We are set up of regions, so we have police officers in every force in the country who identify as LGBT or T. They all generally form part of a local LGBT network made up of police staff and police officers. We've then grouped those regionally. So each region then has several police forces in its area. Those regions then all sit on what we call a national coordinating group. So that's where we all come together and we discuss and we look at ways that we can improve policing for LGBT colleagues, LGBT staff, and our LGBT communities. So in general, we're all made up of LGBT individuals in order to make things better for our LGBT colleagues. We also have allies on our groups. I think it's really, really important that we ensure that we have allies inside our group of people because they make the best advocates for what we need to achieve. I do recognise that historically policing has had a very negative and awkward relationship with the LGBT community. We've operated with little accountability for the treatment of LGBT individuals, utilising laws that prohibited same-sex sexual conduct, arresting LGBT individuals, and targeting their gathering places. Policing interactions have been shaped now by the Association of LGBT officers to try and make that relationship is a much more fruitful and positive interaction. This distrust, this historical distrust, I know has led to a massive confidence gap, and I call it the silent confidence gap because it's not one that's often reported about in comparison to some other hate crimes or non-hate crime incidents. So I understand that there's a massive confidence gap. I understand that there's a massive underreporting of LGBT hate crime, and that the figures we work along and investigations that we've done within policing suggests this is up to 80% of underreporting. What we've got to consider though in those, what we look at as LGBT hate crimes can be anything from a Section 5 public order offence, which is a very low level verbal abuse, up to Section 18's GBHs and even murder. To help you understand where I'm coming from as a police officer when I look at to investigate an LGBT crime, as opposed to a racial or religiously aggravated one, which is an offence within itself, which is why it has a higher uplift. For any other hate crime, I would have to prove the offence. So whether that's proving a Section 5, proving a Section 18 assault, I have to prove that that offence has occurred. I then have to prove that the offence was motivated by the prejudice or hostility of the offender. So it's like a two-step process in terms of evidence that we provide as police officers. So what I'm looking at, what we need to achieve and what we need to do as policing is we need to make sure that we can reduce that confidence gap. We do it by various means. We use Twitter, we use other social medias. Pride is massively important because it's a great opportunity to meet loads of people who identify the same as we do. But I still think there is a lot to do in terms of perhaps working closer with the charities and the third-party reporting centres. I think there's a gap in understanding for both of us. And I think if the charities can understand perhaps more where we're coming from and what we're trying to achieve, and it is there's no doubt that what we want to do is to ensure that people have confidence to report to us and that we can investigate their crimes where they've been victims. So, and we need to understand more what the charities do and what you can do in order to support our victims of crime. And of course, equality of hate crime for me is a big one as well. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm going to hand over to Rob now.
Thanks very much. I feel like Amy's just warmed up for me because I'll be touching on a little bit of what she's already said, but from a very different perspective. So my name's Rob Wilson. I'm the founder and coordinator for the Angels of Freedom. We're a Leeds-based LGBT plus social and support organisation, and we do quite a lot of work within the mainstream LGBT plus communities, whether that's on the bar scene or around the other social groups. I've also been involved in the West Yorkshire Police Leeds District LGBT plus hate crime scrutiny panel for around about 8 years, and for the last 3 years as the independent chair of that panel. So that's kind of what I want to focus on for the next couple of minutes, is reflecting on that experience and the work that I do there, and kind of leads on a little bit from what Amy was saying, because I think that there needs to be more of a focus around building that trust and developing relationships within the communities in order for that better engagement and to increase that reporting. For us, for the hate crime panel, you know, we provide that critical friend function. So we're there to check and challenge the service provisions and the responses at a ground level, at the level that's being delivered at. We're really open and transparent with that relationship that we've got with the police. You know, the reasons why we think it's important to engage, because it provides us with that platform. And, you know, we're really open with it. So we will acknowledge where something's gone wrong, but also the work that's happening in order to put it right. So we've got to be really, really honest about what that situation is. And I strongly believe that this helps to create a better environment and a link between the community and the police forces. It's such an important aspect to it, because the stronger that relationship is with senior officers in the force and LGBT plus community groups and organisations and individuals, the greater visible emphasis there is on officers to get it right. They have to get it right that first time, because if they don't, there's a very good chance that it'll be seen, it won't go under the radar, and they won't kind of get away with it. But on the flip side, there's also the positive part of the cases where we provide that positive feedback, where they've done something really good, and we provide that encouragement and the recognition, so that good work also gets recognised, and then their colleagues see that as well. So, you know, we have the police and the hate crime coordinators along to a number of our different events. We do a monthly cafe. We've been running it for 6 years. And we've got an officer who is at that every month. And the subtleties of the relationship and that embedment within the community has got us to a stage where if someone attends the cafe, they know there's someone there that they can talk to, and it's an officer, and it's someone that they can trust. So there's a lot of familiarity there. I think when it comes to the strategies that support this work, I think that the strategies should be there to support that direct community activity. I don't think that the strategy should be dictating that. I think sometimes we look at it the wrong way around. And I also think that the approach to that needs to be led on a very local level in response to the relationships that are already in place between the police and those organisations. Because, you know, I'm in West Yorkshire, I'm in Leeds, but there's other areas in Yorkshire that I can think of where there's a higher level of challenge between the police and that relationship. So I think that needs to be very, very localised. Touching on what Amy said there, I think there is a need for greater empowerment and extended remit for the police LGBT staff network members. I think, you know, they do a lot of work already around creating inclusive workplaces, and they do a lot of work around developing services, but actually they're ideal representatives for that community outreach activity, for actually going out there and being with the community groups because they identify as LGBT plus, because of the situation that we're in with that level of distrust. But that is an activity that needs to be embedded within their role as an objective, and not something that they're doing as an add-on to what their daily role is. What was I going to say? Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to just touch on a little bit around the development of those services is, you know, I absolutely recognise the work that Galop and other organisations do, but some individuals within local communities want to be able to access the mainstream organisations that are there. They don't want to be seen as being different. So whilst there is a greater need for more support for the national organisations, I think we should also not lose sight of what we're doing at a local level with those local mainstream organisations to make sure that they are LGBT plus inclusive, and that they're not just adding a rainbow and saying job done, that they're actually being inclusive, that their policies and practices are inclusive, and they're demonstrating that in their practices to the community to build that trust. So I'm really looking forward to the next 40 minutes and chatting more about this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robin. You've already started to give some solutions and some examples of great practice. Obviously, I'm from Leeds, so I would agree that Leeds is doing some great stuff. But I think that there is a lot of brilliant knowledge about what works here on this panel. And so we're going to move to some of the questions. The first question, I think we've started to answer, and that's about how can local policing authorities build trust with the LGBT plus community and better encourage those people to report hate crimes. So I think we're going to go to Leni first.
Oh, thanks, Alison. And I totally agree, Rob. You know, LGBT plus buy and for services, I think, are really important for giving a space for LGBT plus people who feel really uncomfortable coming forward to other people. But absolutely, and you know, a big part of what we do is going out and training other organisations in how to do better with LGBT plus people. So I would absolutely agree that there has to be more inclusion in all of the services, but then also the provision of buy and for services are really important for helping the community feel really safe and having those options. Because I think for me, it's always about making sure that the victim has choices and that they are empowered to do the thing that is right for them. And, you know, I find that the focus on reporting with hate crimes, I find that quite difficult because, you know, often what we talk about is we must drive reports, but actually the confidence in the community comes from those reports, you know, being acted upon for those criminal justice outcomes, for those members of the community who want that, for those support services, for those members of the community who do not want a criminal justice outcome, but do want support in order to rebuild what they've experienced and what they've been through, and, you know, that damage to that innate sense of self that comes from that. And I think that often with hate crime, we sort of stop at the report in a lot in the way that we talk about it in policy work and in commissioning, that a lot of it is about driving those reports, whereas actually I think that we would see greater improvement in engagement from the LGBT plus community if we could see, you know, a progression in bringing up those lower prosecution rates, you know, in recognizing the high levels of violence that comes along with LGBT plus hate crime, and you know, that legislative change that recognizes LGBT plus hate crimes as impactful as other forms of hate crime. And I would encourage us to recognize disability hate crimes as being equally as impactful alongside that. You know, there are a number of structural things here that need to be dismantled or worked upon in order to enable the community to feel safer coming forward. And I think that improving those general services, making sure those services are available, but also looking at are there other ways to provide those services to people who want to go to a buy and for service? Are there ways to make sure that 20% of people who want advocacy support get it rather than just 4% of them? You know, all of those things need to be part of sort of a holistic approach to how do we address the damage that is done to a local and a national LGBT plus community through the abuse and violence that we face, and sort of the lower levels of outcomes that I think we see, and that historic, you know, Amy's referenced that historic feeling amongst the community about the lack of support around the things that happen to our community because of who we are.
Thank you. And thanks for the reminder that in the criminal justice system, we're very much evidence-led, and sometimes we need to be compassion-led, feelings-led, people-led, and responding to need is often much more effective than ticking a box and recording numbers. Would either Amy or Rob like to come in? Amy, it's a great question for policing. Have you got anything further to say on this particular item? How do we build better trust with the LGBT plus community and encourage reporting of crimes, whether reporting is actually the thing that we're seeking? Amy.
Hi, yeah, sorry, you've been very bit like a dialect there, so I haven't heard everything you said, but luckily we've got transcripts on, so I've got a bit of an idea of what you were asking there. I'm going to have a slight disagreement there with Galop in terms of, I do think we need to improve reporting. I'll put that down so you can hear me properly, because for me, we do need to evidence stuff in order to be able to drive work to say that we need to improve processes, we need to improve structures, we need to improve policies and the way we deal with stuff. Evidence helps us. So for me, if I can go back and say we've got this amount of hate crime and it's LGBT related, then I can then try and push for more time and more effort being put into my work. So yes, I do think we need to improve hate crime reporting, and we need to ensure that people have got that confidence. And it's not just the police that are responsible for improving that confidence within policing. We need to look at the charities to help us improve the confidence, and for the charities to understand that actually we are here to help. I'm not going to say that we get it right every time, and we need to get better, but without the charity support and the support of our communities, we're going to get hit a dead end. After all, the police are made up of the communities that they serve. So for me, that's why we need to improve our working relationship with the charities. In terms of the criminal justice outcome, I do think that there is a blockage there, and I agree there that we need to perhaps look at how we've put policies in place which we think are there to improve our service delivery to victims of hate crime. But for me, I think they've created barriers when trying to put in those improvements. So, for example, in terms of getting a conviction for an LGBT hate crime, we have to go through CPS. We can't decide that this person there has committed the offence, they've admitted the offence, so we'll charge them. We have to go through CPS. But that creates that barrier, and actually, with the timescales in terms of going to court and then having to bring it up again, and if you're thinking about a low-level public order offence, it kind of seems to be a little bit out of kilter of what the victim probably wants and is trying to achieve. And so I think that perhaps there should be more opportunities for mediation to be put in, or some sort of community reparation, rather than having to go through the court system, because I think that's where we create some barriers for some of our victims. But it shouldn't be an easy way out. It should be an option. And I think one of the things where policing needs to improve, and we are making great strides towards it, is about improving victim contact. And we shouldn't be scared of saying we have failed to find the offender, or we've failed to convict someone of this offence. But what we should be proud of saying is we've put in all the work, we've searched CCTV, we've spoken to witnesses, we've done this, we've done that. Unfortunately, we haven't achieved the outcome, but we have done everything in order to investigate your crime. And I think that's where local policing authorities can help support us, is by supporting the individual police officers who are really, really keen to make changes within policing. So if you support those police officers that put themselves forward to be LGBT liaison officers, you support the LGBT staff associations to support the organisations, that's where you'll start seeing changes and things really being achieved for our victims of crime.
Thanks so much for that, Amy. Bit of chat going on in the chat function, which is brilliant. Can I ask people to put themselves on mute, please? A bit of feedback. Thank you. And Duncan just wants to point out that Leni was not saying that there should be no recording, but the victim's voice should come first. And actually, to be fair to Amy, she did repeat that to say, well, should it just be about prosecution? Should there be other options for victims to be able to come forward? And maybe mediation is one way, and that should definitely be informed by the victims themselves. We've got a really important question here from is it Ben Joseph or Joseph Ben? Don't know which way it is. How can we improve evidencing hate crime when often police don't always record matters as a hate crime, despite often there being being witnesses, CCTV, etc. If we cannot get our experiences recorded properly, how can we build the data that some believe will make a difference? Really good point there, and recording is a major issue for policing. Happy to say that West Yorkshire is outstanding for recording, but not every force shares that mantle. Another question there for someone to answer. Rob, you're doing a lot of work on the scrutiny panel. Do you feel comfortable to respond to that point from Joseph Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned there, West Yorkshire Police do quite well on the data capture around it, and I know that the systems are interrogated to capture hate crimes when they haven't been properly recorded, and where they haven't been referred to a hate crime coordinator for their involvement and input into it. So from my perspective, with the work that we're doing, I'm quite comfortable that we are recording for the majority of cases in the correct way. But obviously I can't speak for nationally and for other forces.
No, and I think it's fair to make the point that hate crime is not always appreciated for the impact that it has on the victim. Yeah. And I think that recently we've heard comments from Sir Tom Windsor, for example, questioning the focus on hate crime when serious violence, rape, serious sexual assault, for example, are so much higher up the agenda for some. And I think that, is that an issue, Rob, that some people, some parts of the system don't always understand the terrible impact of hate crime on a person's ability to, you know, live the life that they're always been intended to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Alison, you know, the whole microaggressions, and it's the build-up, and it's the constants of it. It's not that one incident or one hate crime in isolation. It's just that it compounds all of the experiences of that individual, and, you know, people feeling not worthy. All it does is just make that feeling worse. So I think there is massively a problem when you look at what's happened one time in isolation as being the single thing, but actually that can be a catalyst for some people that significantly makes their life deteriorate. I think from a mental health perspective, it's really concerning.
Absolutely. And I do recall that Leni mentioned hate crime towards disabled people, but if you're both gay, disabled, black, and have other intersectionalities, that can massively manifest that hate crime in a lifelong way. I'm going to take us on to the next question, which is more about accessing support. Again, a major thrust of the point that Leni was making. When they do access support, many LGBT plus victims of hate crime are dissatisfied with the support that they receive. What do we need to do better to improve that support? Leni, you picked some of this up in your earlier comments. Is this a challenge just for policing? What about police and crime commissioners and deputy mayors in my role? What about local authorities? What do you think is the responsibility? Is it all of our responsibilities? What do you think?
That to me, Alison?
Yes.
Okay. So it's a big question, isn't it?
It is.
And, you know, I would always say that, as with many forms of abuse and violence, you need a coordinated community response in order to really tackle sort of those root causes, and also the after effects on the victim, as well as looking at sort of that criminal justice base. And I think, again, sometimes with hate crime, we treat that differently to other forms of abuse and violence, whereas actually the impacts can be as profound and as needing of support as other forms of abuse and violence, that we have better sort of frameworks and infrastructure to address, sort of nationally speaking. And by which I mean locally and nationally, but on a local level. So I think that the issue for me with the question around support services is that if we're looking at on a national level, those support services are still quite patchy. So we have some great stuff where stuff is happening. Like, do not get me wrong, we have some really great programs happening around the country, but it doesn't really cover the entire LGBT plus community. It doesn't address the needs of those members of our community who, for many different reasons, may find coming forward more difficult, may be in a more isolated position, may be less part of a sort of broader community. And I think that there is sort of, you know, we opened a national hate crime helpline in February 2020 in response to the huge amount of contact that we were getting from victims of hate crime saying, I don't know where to go for support, you know, like there is nothing in my local area, I don't know how to reach out, like my local LGBT plus group doesn't really know what to do, like I don't really feel comfortable going to these other places, what do I do? So I think that there is a need for that coordinated response, that sort of recognizing hate crime as a whole and the impact that it has on all of the communities that it affects. You know, we coordinate the Pan London Hate Crime Service, and we work with race partners, we work with religion partners, we work with disability partners, and you know, we see very much the effect that it has on many minoritized communities around the country, and indeed those people who have intersectional identities. And it's about, how do we build that framework, how do we build that infrastructure to make sure that no one is left behind, and that all of those victims have that ability to take the course of action that they want to take in wake of what's happened to them. But we're also addressing that root cause, you know, that 1 in 5 people believing that being LGBT plus is immoral, how do we keep that education process going? How do we look at prevention alongside victim support? So I think it's a very big question, and I'm a bit worried that I'm going to start repeating myself over and over again about the need for support services. So I wonder if anyone else on the panel has thoughts that they want to bring in.
Unmute myself. So thank you for that, Leni. Amy, I know you've talked a bit about third sector organisations being part of the solution in terms of support. Is there anything else you want to add to that? But also, I wonder, do you think it's the responsibility of policing to know about those support systems, to understand that people can use Galop, for example? Should police officers be part of the referring on to support services?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first part of your question is, should we be involved in looking at how we support those victims of crime? So one of the ways that we can do that, and is quite often done across the country, is that if we've got a repeat victim or somebody who's really having difficulties, or they've got other intersectionalities, they're disabled, we can work with other agencies, and we quite often bring together, multi-agency panels. So we would bring together housing, we would bring together any other support services that person's already engaged with, whether it's mental health, whether it's their medical services, whether it's any other sort of social services or child support services. We can then bring those together in a panel, and then we can start looking how we can solve that person's problems or support them best more holistically, rather than it just coming from one individual organisation or another. And it just makes it a more of a rounded approach to helping and support that individual. So that's one way. Should we be the referral arm? Yeah, I think we should. So we're very good at taking the report. We can do that initial safeguarding, we can do that initial emotional support, and we can take the report and we can investigate the offence. We aren't skilled at then putting in the after services, and I think that's where the charities can really, really shine, and that's where we can then start referring off to other support agencies to victim support, because we've always do a referral to victim support, which you can opt out of, but in my force, certainly you will get a call from victim support. If you're a victim of an LGBT hate crime, you will get a call from our community engagement team, and in all likelihood you might then get a call from your local LGBT liaison officer. So sometimes I think that's perhaps a little bit of an overkill, but at least you won't not get support. But yeah, we're there then, we can say, right, this is the best place for you to get support. We don't have that strength yet where we always have the answers, but that's, I think, where we can then bring in those support services to bring in that aftercare and help with that victim support afterwards.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. And in the chat, I've got a brilliant example of where both the hate crime reporting and the advocacy support are brought together. Northern Ireland are just launching a brand new hate crime advocacy service in April, and that's in partnership with the third sector, victim support, migrant centre, and we know that hate crime towards people of colour, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers has massively grown, but also Leni Cheshire, because we pick up on the disability, learning disability hate crime that we know is also growing, and also the Rainbow Project. Brilliant, brilliant example of good practice, and I hope that you'll complete the form at the end of this session to tell us a little bit more about that service, so that we can share it on a national platform. I think that that's an outstanding practice that we should be sharing. So we've got another question, this time from Lucy. What is the panel's view of the best way to ensure that people of all genders are appropriately represented by legal and policy structures, given that sexual crimes are currently referred to as vogue, regardless of the gender identity of the victim? You're nodding there, Amy. I'll come to you first. You'll regret that.
I will, but this has been a little bit of a bugbear for me, and I probably won't be very popular with my bosses here. However, for me, I feel that the Vogue strategy has been at the detriment of the LGBT community. Hopefully I won't lose my epaulets for that. But I agree, and it is a real frustration for me that we should not just focus on Vogue. It is a priority, it is something that is really important, but we also need to, alongside that, have a strategy to support our LGBT victims of sexual offences. And not only that, we need to increase our police officers' understanding of cyber-enabled crime, of chemsex, and sort of cyber crime, which is all linked to these sexual offences, which we just don't have the knowledge of, and it's not shared widely within policing. And I think if we can improve that, but we have that running alongside the VORG strategy, then that's a better answer for me. And yeah, I'll stop going on about my my little bugbear there.
Thank you for that, Amy. And there is some support for you in the chat, and some feeling that the VORG agenda has served to be a detriment to male, trans and non-binary people. And I know that here, where I operate, our brilliant police and crime plan has VORG as one of the elimination of VORG is one of the big areas of interest, and that's a national trend that many PCCs and deputies are also including the elimination of VORG in their plans. And I think that's where the voices of LGBT plus people must be heard in order to make sure that people who don't identify as women or girls don't feel that they're not included, because clearly all the people that we are here to keep safe are included in our police and crime plans. And we just need to get the language right and the engagement right so that people don't feel that they're left out. Rob, would you like to come in?
Yes, please. Thank you. Just a couple of practical points around that, which demonstrate the value of the LGBT plus community groups' involvement and engagement with the police and other organisations. As you're aware, we recently relaunched the Ask for Angela campaign in Leeds, and because our organisation is within the Safer Leeds partnership, we made sure that within the training for the Ask for Angela scheme, when venues sign up, that it is made really clear that although the target audience is young women between a certain age, that actually anyone can ask for Angela, and that support and your response to the ask for support is exactly the same. So if we hadn't been involved in that, then that might not have been the case. So I think we've definitely demonstrated the value from that. And I also think, you know, when there was the prosecution of the guy in Manchester, the serial rapist whose name I forget at the moment, I went back to West Yorkshire on the challenge of, you know, how are you going to respond to it? You know, it is something that's happened in Manchester, but, you know, it just highlights the fact that this happens everywhere. And, you know, the challenge there about creating the campaign within West Yorkshire about it being men as well, and about, you know, that being taken seriously. And, you know, they did training for officers around it, and there's a huge social media campaign around raising awareness. So, you know, it just shows that value of it not just being about the police, that actually as a community group we can help to influence that and have the positive outcomes.
Thank you so much, Rob. And obviously our West Yorkshire Mayor pays for Ask for Angela across West Yorkshire. So I'm delighted that all citizens are included in that scheme. Leni, any additional thoughts that you'd like to add to what is actually quite a challenging agenda? Does violence against women and girls mitigate against other victims?
You know, I'm not really here for a hierarchy of victimhood, if I'm honest. Like, I think it's also really important that we bear in mind that there are women and girls, cis and trans, within the LGBT plus community, and I would not want to negate the disproportionate effect of violence and abuse against women and girls and the importance of that movement. And I think that the key thing for me is that when we are looking structurally at what creates those disproportionate effects on minoritized groups around abuse and violence, that we are making sure that there is no one being left behind in that conversation. So, you know, when we approach but the concerns around the violence against women and girls approach with a statement on men and boys. What are we doing with non-binary people? Like, where do they end up? When do they end up being left? You know, can we look at the frameworks that are being set up and the ways in which that's not inclusive of LGBT plus women within services that are being created? You know, because there are ways in which some of the spaces that are created in lots of different ways can fail to be inclusive of our community or appropriate for our community. So I don't think, like, I'm not interested in setting up a hate crime against rogue sort of situation. I would also say that we are very in favour of misogyny hate crime being recognised as a legitimate form of hate crime in law. You know, I'm a lesbian, I'm a woman. I don't think I've ever experienced homophobia that isn't also misogyny. Do you know what? You know, like, I mean, there are so many ways in which these things intersect that I think breaking them apart isn't particularly helpful. And I'm not interested in like having that sort of approach to it. I think I'd much rather see a clear approach for ensuring that all victims of abuse and violence are given the holistic response that is right for them and the thing that they want, and they are empowered to receive the kind of support and the kind of outcomes that they're looking for. You know, my interest is always about making sure that my community, when something happens to them, whether that be hate crime, whether that be conversion therapy, whether that be domestic abuse or sexual violence, that the response that they get is as good as it would have been if they were anyone else. And this really focused on what they need in order to feel safe and to get those outcomes. So, you know, I think that's always my approach. It's always about how do I make things best for my community rather than trying to create competition between different communities. So, I mean.
Yeah, and lots of love for what you're saying in the chat, Leni. And I, you know, I'm chairing this, so I don't have a view, but I think it's important that we recognise that hate crime is something that any one of us can face at any time in our lives, depending on the circumstances, of course. But it is definitely the case that this conversation about violence against women and girls has left some people feeling that it doesn't include them. And so the language of VOG, the intention around it, if we're going to encourage more LGBT plus people to feel that they're included too, I think that it's absolutely right that that question is asked, and we think about how we as leaders in the criminal justice system respond to that question so that everyone feels able to take part in the criminal justice system and get justice from the criminal justice system. But absolutely what you said. And as I say, lots of love in the chat for that. Some challenges around Ask for Angela. And I think that, again, that point is well made. And I do think that those of us who are commissioning Ask for Angela need to do some really good evaluation of its impact on whether or not it has worked. Although I would say, in regards to those people, those bar staff asking who's Angela, the training has definitely fallen down in those areas. So maybe that's another area of improvement, that those bar staff include LGBT people in their understanding of who Angela could be. But definitely, if we need to improve that, then I think it's right that we take that into account. So the next question that I have, and possibly the last one, as we've got 10 minutes left, is what the role of local authorities is in addressing LGBT hate crime. We've talked a lot about policing other criminal justice partners. What about local authorities? They have the biggest presence in our lives. They do everything from emptying the bins to providing community centres. What can they do better and differently to improve the lived experience of LGBT plus people? And I'm going to start with Amy.
You've caught me out there. I really wasn't expecting you to come to me first there. I think it's where we can work together. I'm coming from a national LGBT perspective here, I guess, and it's about being able to pool our resources and use the strengths that the local authorities have, that perhaps with advertising, with getting the messaging out, and supporting us in perhaps events where we can pass that message out. And increase confidence in the community. For me, I find it very important that if I can be out at events run by the local community, or if I can attend local groups, and they can see that I'm a visibly gay out woman and police officer, that hopefully that will start breaking down the barriers. And that's one of the main aims for me. But definitely it's about working together and having that sort of pooled resources.
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective around the practicalities of working on the ground on this, we have really strong engagement with the police around tackling hate crime, raising awareness, increasing reporting. I think the only time that we ever really do anything with the local authority is around Hate Crime Awareness Week. So I think there is definitely improvements that could be made there around that community engagement and the focus on it as something that has a serious detrimental effect on the lived experience of LGBT people within the community.
Thank you, Rob. And Leni, what's your view of the role of local authorities?
Oh, good question. So I think the interesting thing about trying to provide support for LGBT plus communities now is that, as I'm sure we're going to mention repeatedly throughout this session, the way that LGBT plus services have been commissioned over traditionally have been very much focused on sort of London, Manchester, Brighton, those places that our community used to move to because we were not safe other places, right? And the joys of the progress towards some form of equality that we have made over the last 50 years is that we're not just in those places in the same way anymore. And I think that the challenge now is for local authorities to really understand the size of their LGBT plus community, the number of people that they have, the amount of support those people need, really understanding the local need around that as well. Because, you know, the position for a victim of a hate crime or any other form of abuse and violence who is LGBT plus, who is within a much more isolated, much smaller number of fellow LGBT plus people, like within a system that they feel is less open to their LGBT plus identity, where they feel less safe in general, it's going to have a very different experience to someone who is in a place that has got all of those wonderful commission services, who has got a much bigger community, who has more of that sort of support system set up for them. And I think that we need to start on a local level with really understanding the local need, and then looking at what the solutions to addressing that local need might be. So, you know, one of the things that we see sometimes, and I would not put everyone in this boat by any stretch, but we do sometimes see the local authority sort of going to whatever LGBT plus group might be nearby and saying, you're LGBT plus, you can sort this out, right? You have the expertise to deal with this, right? And that puts both that LGBT plus group and the victims that they're trying to serve in quite a difficult position, and potentially like puts both of those people in quite an unsafe place and quite a lot of responsibility on the local community in a way that is not necessarily requested and certainly not necessarily ideal. So I think it's about really understanding what is your local need, and then how might you go about meeting that? You know, do you talk to other local authorities nearby you, work out what the communal need is and see if there is a service that can be commissioned off the back of that? Is there really committed work that needs to be done for those general services that are local? Are there better pathways that need to be built with services that have the capacity to work across county lines, of which there are very few, I might add. So like it's about looking, really understanding where we're coming from and what the community needs, and then looking at what those solutions might be. And I would always encourage that is from a really strong evidence base. You know, and I recognize that we've just been talking about 90% of hate crimes going unreported, and that making that quite difficult. But there are ways of doing needs mapping that does not rely on that specific data. And I think unless we understand the breadth of the community and the breadth of the experience of the community, we're not going to be commissioning the kind of services and addressing the inclusion within the existing services that we need to. You know, bear in mind that the census has never even recorded LGBT plus people until very recently, and we still don't have that data. Like, we still don't really know where the LGBT plus community is and how disparate it is, and what the populations are and where. Beyond that, we know that they're in London, Manchester and Brighton. We all know that they're everywhere else as well. I say they, we're everywhere else as well. And I think that it's that recognition. There are LGBT plus people in every local authority. They all, like, a significant proportion of them will have needs, and really understanding that is where we have to start.
Thank you for that. And we've got a very quick question in the last 3 minutes about advancements being made in refuge accommodation countrywide for the LGBT plus community. Anyone got any knowledge on that subject that they'd like to tell us about? Leni, I presume you might know. Yes.
Yeah, I do have. I was assuming we would get to refuge and emergency accommodation in the next bit, if I'm honest with you. So I hadn't included it in this. I think that I think it is not a secret that refuge and emergency accommodation does not currently serve our community particularly well. That there is a real lack of available, appropriate refuge and emergency accommodation in this country. Like, that is even less commissioned than those sort of advocate support services that we've been talking about. You know, we know that there are very few places that men and boys can go. We know that non-binary people will have to make an incorrect, potentially, decision about how they represent themselves in order to seek support. We know that lesbians and bi women might not feel comfortable within the refuge and emergency accommodation that they're put in. It may not be that that's safe for them. So it's not. I would say that what we currently see is our community having to make a very difficult decision between going into what might be a dangerous situation in emergency accommodation that might not be safe for them, staying in a situation that is abusive and dangerous to them, or being homeless. You know, we have clients who live in their cars. We have had a client who's had to live in a greenhouse because there are not those options for our community. And I think that's one of the major areas that we are failing LGBT plus people in this country, those who are at the end of abuse and violence that is so significant and so requires them to flee, but leaves them with nowhere safe to go. And I think when we're, you know, to link that to hate crime still, because I know we're going to talk about this more in domestic abuse and sexual violence, you know, a significant proportion of anti-LGBT plus hate crime is perpetrated by neighbours. You know, people are living in homes that are not safe. We see clients having their homes broken into by their neighbours because they do not approve of those people being LGBT plus and living near them. You know, there is a broad need for LGBT plus recognition of the need for LGBT plus emergency accommodation, and that needs to be nationwide, and it needs to be appropriate, it needs to be safe, and it needs to not leave any of our community having to face this awful decision of staying in a dangerous situation or going into a situation that is inappropriate.
Thank you for so much for that, Leni. And of course, that's another responsibility of local authorities, that they could look to extend provision for LGBT plus communities, and some do. Let's not forget that some do, but many don't, and it's definitely a gap. Can I thank you all for your amazing contributions this evening, Rob, Amy and Leni, who will be returning in a moment to the next panel. The contributions that you've made have been really important to building a picture of what it's like for LGBT plus people facing hate crime here in England and Wales, but also some of the potential solutions to that going forward. Thank you everyone who has been contributing in the chat. Some strong feelings, and obviously LGBTQ plus persecution, hate. It does evoke strong feelings. Both my kids are gay. I understand from others' perspective the damage, the hatred of someone because of who they are, how that can have a lifelong implication. So thank you everyone so much. I think that there's so much more that could have been said. We don't have the time. Hopefully this will lead to another conversation in another place and some decisions being made that will support the situation for LGBT plus people in this country and beyond. Thank you. I'm now going to move us on to the next session on domestic abuse and sexual violence. And I'm going to hand over once again to the 4 panellists in this instance to just give us a very brief update about the work that they're doing. And the first person I'm going to call on is Nicholas Rogers, who is a London Assembly member.
Thank you, Alison. It's very good to be with you all this afternoon. So I'm Nick Rogers. I'm the Assembly member for South West London, which is the fine boroughs of Hounslow, Richmond and Kingston. I was elected in May last year. I have a background in railway operations, and I have to be honest that I'm far more likely, really, to be on a panel talking about trains and signalling and geeky stuff about the Piccadilly line. But my interest in this was piqued because when I was elected onto the Assembly, I was put on the Police and Crime Committee of the Assembly. And there were a lot of discussions about domestic abuse. And every single one of those discussions was directed towards heterosexual domestic abuse. And I was questioning who's speaking up for my community on this issue. So Assembly members, if you know, don't have an awful lot of power. The one thing we can do is ask questions. So I asked some questions of the Mayor about domestic abuse amongst London's LGBT plus community. And the figures I found showed that it's a growing problem. It's up over 31% in London over the last 4 years. And that's clearly significantly underreported because research also showed that 40%, almost 40% of LGBT plus people have suffered domestic abuse. So there's a big issue in London. It's growing, it's not going away, it's getting worse. And also those discussions we were having on the Police and Crime Committee didn't account for the fact that there are some very specific types of domestic abuse that are found in the community that aren't elsewhere, that require specific training from police and the criminal justice system and specific services. And I know we've got people on the panel who deliver those services. I'm looking at Leni and Astrid in particular. So I'm telling you nothing that you guys don't already know. But the stuff that we do have is oversubscribed and not just simply not enough. And Leni, you spoke movingly about the situation with emergency accommodation. And in this discussion I had with the Outreach Project, they had some emergency funding over the pandemic to provide such accommodation. There were 134 referrals for 4 bed places. So there's again a massive need. This needs to get put onto the radar more in London. So my work with this, my thrust with this, I'm writing a report that's looking at the situation in London specifically on how we commission domestic abuse services for the community, what improvements we would want to see. There has been some funding in the last week, I think, announced, or last 2 weeks announced from central government to MOPAC, the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime, 11 million, some of which will go to our community, but it's not clear to me exactly what that funding is going to be used for, where it's going to go to. When I asked the Mayor, he said, "Oh, I'll write to you," which is always like, okay, you don't know, do you? You're gonna have to find out. So my thrust here is to actually learn from you guys. If you've got examples of best practice that's going on in your parts of the country, I'd love to know. I'd love to fold that into my report. Yeah, I'd just like to learn and find out how that report that I'm doing can serve our community best and improve the delivery of domestic abuse services for the community in London.
Thank you for that scrutiny and rigour at the police and crime panel in London there, Nicholas. I'm going to now move on to Duncan Craig, who is the Chief Exec of Survivors Manchester. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alison. Hi, everybody. My name is Duncan Craig. I'm the founder and chief executive of Survivors Manchester. Survivors Manchester is a third sector organisation supporting boys and men and their loved ones, and also trans and non-binary people who feel that this is the right space for them, across Greater Manchester and the Northwest from our prison service. I always make this declaration in these spaces. I am a cisgendered gay male and also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, sexual exploitation and rape as well. And what I want to talk about today very much is going to be focused on men and boys, but I want to recognise the need, as Leni so eloquently talked about before, the need for women and girls, particularly women and girls who don't feel that the Vogue strategy is meeting their needs. And also, I'm doing a lot of learning at the moment around my trans and non-binary brothers and sisters, and however people identify, and want to make sure that I continue to do my learning.
Thank you, Duncan. We're going to move on to Astrid now, who is the Senior LGBT Plus Specialist IDVA at Switchboard.
Hi everyone, thank you Alison. So yeah, my name's Astrid, my pronouns are she, her, and I work at the LGBTQ Plus Switchboard in Brighton and Hove. So I specifically work in their domestic abuse project. So we were commissioned by our Police and Crime Commissioner in 2021, and our project has launched earlier this year. So Switchboard, if anyone who doesn't know, we kind of started in the 70s initially as a helpline, and then we've kind of grown over the years. So we now run a multitude of different projects, such as a trans and non-binary link service, a health and inclusion project, disability and neurodiversity, dementia, and then also our domestic abuse project. So a little flavour of me, I've worked in this role for nearly sort of 2 years now. So I work frontline with a caseload of LGBTQ plus survivors. Myself, and I would say Switchboard as a service, is very passionate about kind of justice, fighting injustice, and particularly trans rights, although that might be more of a personal thing for me. I feel like I've got quite a unique experience as I belong to the group that is impacted. So whilst I'm very privileged, which feels like a bit of a sad thing to say, that I've never experienced domestic violence and abuse, I can immediately connect to the community that I am serving, because I can easily, the roles could be reversed, they could be me, I could be them. So just to give you a flavour of some statistics of the sector, so if we think about femicide and domestic abuse in kind of the past year or so, so the femicide census that was published in 2020 found that 110 women were killed by men in that year. 52% of those women were killed by a current or former partner, and 45% of those deaths were described as overkill. So the amount of violence and force used was disproportionate to their loss of life. I want to point out that trans women are not counted in femicide statistics. So when we're talking about the death of women and girls, we're not talking about me. If I died tomorrow at the hands of a man, I wouldn't be counted. In the Office for National Statistics kind of report from kind of November 2021, it was found that domestic abuse crimes were up by 6% to 845,734. Referrals from the CPS for a charge were down by 3%, and the charging rate was down from 76% to 70%. So that's not a personal attack on anyone, that's just the numbers and how they show up. We know from other reports and research, like from Galop, for example, that gay and bisexual men are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse as cisgender heterosexual men, and trans people are the most likely group to experience domestic abuse. However, again, as we know from we've talked about, we're not showing up in those statistics. So I guess what are the gaps? For me, what I would say is one of the gaps is trans inclusion. So there's a massive amount of trans exclusion in the community, unfortunately, in Vogue. And I'm glad to hear and see that there are other people who have a gripe with the term Vogue, because I very much personally do. As we've seen this week, in this kind of the past week, Women's Aid have come out with their statement, which I think we can all safely say is not great, and that's being quite kind. We are seeing, for example, J.K. Rowling just going off on the warpath all the time. why that's needed, I'm not sure. We are seeing a lack of provision, and definitely locally we are seeing, in my opinion, things going backwards slightly. So we had our domestic abuse strategy published, that's kind of spanning 2021 to kind of the next 3-4 years. There was very minimal mention of LGBTQ+ provision, and any mention that was made was kind of met with the caveat of, but women and girls are the most affected. What was most concerning to me of kind of the two things there were that it stated that any future multi-occupancy refuge provision is going to be single sex, and by single sex they mean cisgender women and girls, and also that the public consultation that was put out on the council website was basically jumped on by a lot of anti-trans groups. Myself and a colleague of mine, as well as another practitioner, went to a meeting with our VAW commissioner to basically say what you've done is committed a hate crime, and what you've done is published hate speech. And to be fair to them, they acknowledged that, they issued a public apology, and they've paused any further consultations around VAW and are working on figuring out how they can make all of this inclusive. But I think what concerned me was the fact that it took 3 queer people to come to them and say, VAW doesn't represent everybody, and they went, oh. So that's my kind of, I guess, take on things in the lay of the land. So yeah, really excited to be here tonight, and thank you so much for kind of inviting me, and I'm looking forward to hearing more and your questions.
Thank you so much for coming, Astrid. And finally, we'll go back to Leni, Chief Exec of Galop, for her opening comments.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks to everyone who's already spoken as well. Some really important points being raised. So I'm going to try and not repeat anything that's already been said quite eloquently by panelists before me. So first off, it's really nice to, not nice is the wrong thing to say, but it's really refreshing to be talking about domestic abuse and sexual violence, because I think often the conversation about abuse and violence in our community goes hate crime, domestic abuse, and then it sort of stops. And we can be completely omitted in its entirety from any kind of conversation around sexual violence and the needs of LGBT+ people, specifically around sexual violence. So it's really nice to be able to be in a space where we're actually talking about both at the same time. I think that's really important. It's often, you know, those things are not as over here and distant from each other as it can be made out to be. Having said that, I'm going to talk about domestic abuse and then sexual violence, just to like really confuse things. So again, the picture here is very much the majority of LGBT+ people do not come forward when they are victims of domestic abuse. You know, we've got numbers on that. We know 60% of LGBT+ victims and survivors of domestic abuse don't come forward to generalist services, and 80% don't come forward to the police. You know, that's the majority of our community do not feel comfortable seeking support from those services, which are the ones that for the majority of people are the ones that are available. We know that is different where we have LGBT+ specialist services like ours, like Astrid's. You know, those make a really big difference in bridging that gap, in overcoming that fear that in that moment where you are vulnerable, you are in a position where you are seeking help from someone, that you may come up against anti-LGBT+ prejudice, that you might have to educate people so that they can recognize that you are being abused, which we see as something that our clients come up against time and time again. You know, that you're having to expend all of that extra energy in order to advocate for yourself to get that support. So we know that that is an issue for our community. We know that there are some very good examples of some police responses that are very good to LGBT+ people who are victims of domestic abuse, but equally there are some very poor responses where, you know, police who are called to a domestic abuse incident might not recognize that as domestic abuse because it happens between, for example, a same-sex couple, and they may misinterpret that as 2 men fighting rather than a domestic abuse situation with a perpetrator and a victim. And the same can happen to 2 women, you know, and the same sort of misinterpretations, the same prejudice responses can happen to trans and non-binary people as well in those situations. Like, you can get a very patchy response from those services, and that lack of consistency does not engender trust more broadly from the LGBT+ community, because we've all heard those stories from people that we know, which means that we are going to be more nervous about coming forward. One of the things that gets really locked out of the conversation about domestic abuse as a whole, we think about intimate partner, and don't get me wrong, the conversation about domestic abuse is often like straight man, straight woman, they're both white, they're both in their mid-30s, they've probably got 2 kids, and that's sort of the image. So there's broad issues around how we talk about domestic abuse as a whole. But for our community, often we completely miss out family abuse, which is something massive that happens to our community in our home spaces that is not talked about enough within the context of domestic abuse. And that's an additional barrier to people coming forward and recognizing that they can seek that help. We have a report coming out in 2 days' time that is going to have some really stark figures on how prevalent familial abuse is amongst our community, and actually the broad spread of ages at which abuse from your family can start. This is not just an issue for children, this is an issue for adults as well. As I think has been referenced before, the use of our identities as part of abuse. You know, we work with people whose visas, they are from places where they will be less safe than they are here. Their visas are attached to their relationship, and that is then used against them by a partner. You know, there are things where partners who are not out, their abusive partner can hold that over them and say, you know, unless you comply to what I am expecting of you, then this is what is going to happen to you, and you are going to lose all of your other support mechanisms and all of your other relationships. You know, there are things that are targeted against us specifically in those forms of abuse that are about our identities and how our identities are exploited by our perpetrators. And I'd also just like to flag very briefly, domestic homicide reviews often, you know, fail to properly recognise LGBT plus victims, often fail to address enough LGBT plus domestic abuse cases and recognise those as domestic abuse homicides. And when we're not using those reviews properly and recognising our community within those reviews, then that is also a lack of progression for our community through that mechanism that should be open to us. Conversion therapy is a form of domestic abuse. It happens predominantly within people's homes in this country. There is an image from America that it's like you get sent to a camp and you're put in a camp and that's what happens to you. No, what happens in this country, and I would argue also in America, is that a lot of the time it's perpetrated by people's own families, it's in their own homes. So many cases of conversion therapy are also cases of abuse, of domestic abuse. And again, you're seeing that like lack of emergency accommodation, lack of recognition of conversion therapy cases as a whole. Like we have seen cases of support workers saying, I agree with what your parents are doing. Your parents are trying to make you better. Go back home. You know, this is without a framework to recognize conversion therapy. We are failing to get young, often young, not always young, LGBT plus people out of really abusive conversion situations. And you know, we released a report in December that showed that from our research, having spoken to almost 1,000 LGBT plus survivors of sexual violence, that 1 in 4 of them had experienced that sexual violence in order to convert them from their identity or to punish them for that identity. You know, this is a really significant amount of sexual violence that is perpetrated on the basis of who we are, driven by prejudice against LGBT plus people. And there are not those spaces where people are able to flee that. You know, we have 1 in 4 1 in 4 young homeless people is LGBT plus. There is a reason for that. You know, we're not creating that infrastructure that supports our community when we need to flee. And then when it comes to sexual violence, whether that's a conversion therapy or not, when it comes to sexual violence, we have another report coming out in May. We're doing a lot of reports. We're doing a lot of reports at the moment. That's not normal. It's just all bunched together for some reason. We have another report coming out later this year that is going to show extraordinarily low levels of those cases reaching court for our community, but it's also going to show a really significant proportion of our community that never tells anyone what's happened to them. You know, violence that happens against trans bodies, sexual violence that happens against trans bodies, sexual violence that is punishing you for who you are, sexual violence between same-sex people, all of those things put up enormous barriers for members of our community coming forward to general services and talking about what has happened to them and seeking support. And they're never in the picture. They are never in the frame. We are never in the frame around sexual violence and sexual assault in this country. And I think it's really important that we start addressing that with the same level of vocalness that we have about domestic abuse, that we can't pull these things apart, that we cannot leave behind sexual violence victims while we're working on domestic abuse. Do you know what I mean? And then again, just reinforcing that real lack of places for people to go, and the socioeconomic impacts on people who have to face that choice between fleeing somewhere that may be very far away, that may be inappropriate, becoming homeless, or staying in those abusive situations. All of those things have lifelong impacts, you know, on your potential, on your ability to fulfill your potential, on education, on your finances, on all of those things. And I think that we need to recognise that that is happening to our community because of a lack of proper response and support, and ensuring that that framework that's set up and that infrastructure that's set up is prepared to understand who we are, what we go through, and what we need.
Thank you, Leni. Again, lots of people agreeing with you in the chat, and helpfully there's the bank conversion therapy survey that people can fill in and send to their MPs if they'd like to do that. So the first question that I'm going to ask the panel is around LGBT plus specialist services, which are generally few and far between, as Leni has already pointed out. The question is, how can generalist IDVA and ISVAs, so independent domestic violence abuse advocates and independent sexual violence advocates, be made more LGBT plus inclusive, and how can we push for these specialist services beyond London, Manchester and Brighton? And Duncan, I'm going to ask you first.
Thank you. So we had the first male ISVA service in the UK, and I'm really proud of that fact. I think it's an interesting question in terms of how can ISVA, I can't really speak about IDVA because that's not my specialism at all. I can only speak about ISVA. How can they be more LGBT aware? I'm not sure I've seen anything that says that they're not, and I'm very much engaged with ISVA services across the UK. I have 4 ISVAs, sorry, and across Greater Manchester we have, I think there's 27 ISVAs across the whole of Greater Manchester, including the SARC and Greater Manchester Rape Crisis. And from my own patch, and also my work with Men and Boys Coalition and Survivors Trust over the years, I used to deliver on a training course for ISVAs around male victims. I think ISVAs are quite well served. What I do think is that sexual violence services, particularly those that are kind of by us for us services, probably have a lot more understanding of females, particularly kind of gay, bisexual females, than they do with trans, non-binary and gay and bisexual males. And I think there's probably some more work to do around that, but I'm not too sure. I mean, I bow down to Leni's expertise in this kind of stuff, but I'm not too sure there's ever been any kind of review to look at whether ISVA services are meeting the needs of LGBT people.
Thank you. Astrid, what's your view of the role of ISVAs and IDVAs? How can we make them more inclusive, particularly of trans and non-binary people? And as I think you said at the beginning, how do we get these services out to all our communities?
Yeah, it's a massive question, a really good question. I think it's challenging because I think, as a reference in the sort of opening statements, the climate around Vogue, and that includes sexual violence, absolutely, like well pointed out, is very kind of, I guess, like polarizing. Is that kind of the right word? It feels very kind of us and them, very othering, and it's really hard because if your mainstream service in your local area is a kind of women's only service, where do you go? And you maybe go to a national service like Galop, absolutely, but again, then that's great for national support, but it may not have the roots and connections to your local area, which is a massive challenge. So I think part of it is kind of coming from the top, and I think we need to start unpicking some of those basically false and exclusionary narratives about trans women being a threat in refuges, and about domestic abuse, whilst yes, again, is predominantly a woman's issue, blah blah blah. Let's say it all again, because we all know this, but let's start moving away from some of those conversations, because it's just kind of like, because the policies that are being written, the legislation that's being made, the training courses that are being distributed, the resources that are being given to frontline services, the people who are applying for those jobs, are then all kind of feeding into one monogamous narrative of like violence against women and girls, and that's it. You know, I went to a training course this morning, and the first thing the person said is, whilst I acknowledge that, you know, anyone can be a victim of organ abuse, when I say victims, I'm going to be referring to women. And then myself and my colleague were sat there like, so why are we here? Because that's nothing to do with us. Do you know what I mean? It's completely irrelevant and completely pointless. So I think it's that, and I think that employers and workplaces and local authorities also need to take on the responsibility of challenging and coming forward, challenging these harmful narratives and coming forward and saying, I stand with the trans community, because so many people do, but a lot of people are afraid to say it because of the backlash they will get. And actually, I think we need to start taking a bit more of a zero tolerance view on all forms of abuse and isms, so racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, etc. But, you know, I think sometimes it's like trans inclusion is kind of controversial, and it's kind of, it's not sexy, it's not glamorous. I think a lot of organisations take great pride in saying they're anti-racist or they're serving the BAME community, because that has been quite trendy, or that's a very, I don't want to sort of take away from that argument, but it kind of, I think sometimes it could be seen as a less controversial thing to say, well, we're not racist. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, people are like, yeah, you can't really argue with that. Whereas I'm trans inclusive, then you will have a community of people who will say, oh, but what about the women? What about the men who may sneak into refuges? So I think there's kind of a massive thing around like education, myth busting, and kind of arming people to feel safe to ask questions and to make mistakes, but also to kind of equip them all, because I think a lot of mainstream services do want to be trans inclusive, but they're just terrified that they'll either, you know, be attacked by Women's Aid or, you know, be attacked by JK Rowling on Twitter. And it's kind of like there's this massive culture of fear, I think, essentially around everything, and that kind of doesn't leave any room for learning and for growth.
Thank you so much, Astrid. And trans rights are human rights, and I'm a massive trans and non-binary supporter, and as a deputy mayor stroke PCC, people understand PCC better than the deputy mayor bit. I think it's a massive responsibility on police and crime commissioners to commission services that are LGBT plus friendly, and we do that here in West Yorkshire, and definitely have ISVAs and IDVAs that work with men, women, trans men and women, and those from non-binary identities. So it can be done, it is being done here in West Yorkshire, and it's definitely something that we need to be encouraging more PCCs to do, because it's a duty under the Equality Act. I'm going to move on to another question, and Nicholas, I'm going to bring you in at this stage. One of the questions in the chat is around the Victims Bill, which is currently out for further consultation, although I think the consultation is not long closed. Are there any hopes for LGBT inclusion in the revised Victims Bill? What do you think?
Can I jump on that one?
Oh, yeah.
Go for it, Duncan.
Oh, sorry, Nicholas.
No, go for it. I was marshalling my thoughts, so you go for it.
Okay, well I'll just say
marshalling, and Duncan can start.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly. So you're right, Alison. The consultation has now closed. I mean, I've been heavily involved in that consultation. I think what we have to keep hold of at the moment, and this is for everybody, is that the 12 victim rights become rights, because right at the moment, the 12 victim rights of the Victim Code are not rights. We call them rights, but they're not in legislation. And my hope is that the rights become legislative, which means that we can hold people to account for them. That was just my 2 pennies worth. Go for it, Nicholas.
No, well, I absolutely agree. But yeah, there's no point in having vague rights that aren't backed up by anything. So yeah, we need to make sure that anything that comes out of this is concrete and solid and in law, and not just a vague hope or aspiration.
Yeah, and panellists hopefully will be happy to hear that here in West Yorkshire we did take part in the consultation, and we did push for example, for LGBT survivors to be anonymous if they go through the criminal justice process, just as all rape victims should be anonymous. We wanted that to be also a right of the LGBT plus community, and I included that in my feedback. Leni, anything you'd like to say about the Victims Code?
Well, so the Victims Bill, what a consultation to put out for 6 weeks for a response over Christmas. Hey, for anyone who was involved in that was a stressful experience. But I think what I was glad to see was a recognition of the need for specific funding for reading the consultation in a hopeful manner, specific funding from a centralised pot for minoritized groups of people, which I would expect to include LGBT plus people. And I think that if we can have that built in to a landmark bill like this, to recognise, as bills so often fail to, the needs of minoritized groups explicitly in that way, and to have that sort of that onus on the government, on everyone who is involved in creating that community response, to remember minoritized groups, and not only to remember them, but to create an effective support service and support system for those communities. I think that will be an incredibly important and valuable outcome from that legislative process. And I think my only worry is that the LGBT plus community, alongside many other minoritized communities, have so much less overall power, so much less overall voice, so much less overall capacity to influence, to ensure that that provision goes into law. That I would be concerned that, you know, the history of a minoritized community is that we are minoritized. And that means that we often have less of the voice than we need to in order to create the sort of structural change that we're looking at. So I would encourage allies in the room who would like to support the LGBT plus community to really look at that provision and join in pushing for that to go into law.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is around data. And I know that data collection around both domestic abuse and rape and serious sexual violence against the LGBT plus community is incredibly poor. I have raised this here locally, but it is a big issue. And so with that rather poor local and national data set, how can we make cases to those commissioning services to take the needs of LGBT plus survivors seriously when designing and implementing services? And I'm going to ask Nicholas first.
Thank you. Yes, I spoke in my opening statement about the mismatch between the number of cases and the number of people in the community actually experiencing domestic abuse, and unless you get a true picture, it's difficult to make the case, or it's harder to make the case for commissioning the correct kinds of services that we need. So we absolutely need to make sure that we're getting the right data. One example from my research, Leni, this goes directly to your work. We were looking through through MOPAC to understand the volume of calls you received to your helpline. I don't think they have that data. So they certainly weren't able to provide it to us. And for me, that for MOPAC, that would be a basic barometer to show the needs of the community in London. So that sort of data, I think, would be incredibly valuable for the Mayor's Office of Police and Crime to have in order to use as evidence to make cases for commissioning services and providing funding. But others as well, we need to look at how we drive up reporting, how we deal with this chronic underreporting of DA in the community, and some things that I would suggest in the report that I'll publish in however many weeks' time. For example, the Mayor should put aside advertising space on TfL to promote domestic abuse services to the community, to raise awareness of where people can go to report stuff, where they can get help, so you get a better understanding of the landscape in London and get better quality data to make better quality decisions on.
Thank you, Nicholas. Duncan?
Not too sure. Let me just gather my thoughts around that.
Okay, shall we go to Astrid? Because I think the issue is that we don't collect the data. Policing are not required to collect the data, and that's a big issue, because we can't understand the scale of the problem, and therefore you can't commission services if you don't have the data, because everything's evidence-led in policing in particular.
Yeah, sorry, Astrid. I'll just say before, the reason why I hesitate is because data's just really poor anyway in this area. And I suppose I'm trying to find an answer to say, how can we make really, really, really poor data a bit better? And we're not necessarily even recording genders before we get to any other protected characteristic. So data within the criminal justice system, particularly around sexual and domestic violence, needs a complete overhaul. The systems at the Crown Prosecution Service and the systems at the police need to be able to speak to each other, because they don't. The Office of National Statistics needs to work closely with the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office on this kind of stuff. So how can we make it better for LGBT people? How can we make it better for victims, for my fellow victims? I suppose is that where I'm at. Sorry, Astrid, go for it.
Yeah, great question there, Duncan. Astrid.
No, thank you, Duncan. That was great. I think Duncan raises a really valid point, that like in thinking about the data and how we can improve it, it's like you're so right that the basic data in general, like I can speak definitely for our service, we were transferred, our team was transferred over from a previous commission service because of some commissioning changes. And so we had to get to grips with a whole new case management system, and our reporting was god awful for ages because we didn't know how to report. And that was on the basic things like number of referrals, the types of crimes that were associated with said referrals, whether they were domestic abuse or not, what was their risk level. And then, yeah, basic things around gender, local authority code, whether they were East Sussex or Brighton, you know, those. And then, yeah, so when we start talking about more in-depth, and actually the system that we had, for example, gender had like gender at birth, male, female or trans. And we were like, that's not all right, is it? So yeah, as you say, how do we take already crap data and try and turn it into something good? I think another thing that one of my colleagues has raised with me as well is that I think oftentimes LGBTQ plus people are kind of, we're over-researched but underrepresented, in that everybody always wants to do a survey or a dissertation or a questionnaire about the needs of LGBT people. And I think sometimes it's like potentially the community is also a bit tired and a bit lacking of faith, because there's so many conversations, consultations, strategies that happen that don't always turn into tangible action. And I think that can be really, really sad. And actually you think, well, what was the point in me sitting for 2 hours with, I don't know, the Sussex Police Outreach Focus Group to talk about my issues with reporting, and then it doesn't go anywhere. But I also think other things around, you know, how are we defining vulg? How are we defining you know, these types of crimes, you know, and how, what are our definitions and what is that looking like? What are we considering to be this, that, and something else? Do you know what I mean? And as definitions change and as offensive changes, so say, for example, coercive control was like, what, 2015, 2016, which was great, but then you've missed a whole load of coercive control data from years past. So I think it is thinking about, yeah, how are we getting out into those communities? Because the mean services are they're not coming forward. It's kind of that cyclical loop, isn't it, of like, people aren't coming forward, so we can't capture the data, so we can't report it, so we're not giving the provision, so people aren't coming forward, and it just goes round and round and round. So it's kind of, yeah, I think perhaps, because I think something that was raised in the hate crime section was that we're not giving the provision because there's not the data. And I think for me, it's kind of a point that was raised perhaps earlier by the police, is that maybe then the system is flawed, because actually the system requires evidence, and actually that's a lot of onus on victims to come forward. And it almost feels, and I don't want to accuse anybody of making this implication, but it almost felt like somebody was saying, well, if we don't have the evidence, it didn't happen. And it's like, well, I understand, like, because I understand in a technical sense in terms of the CPS and policing, they need to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, blah, 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 that this offence happened. And obviously, if you've just got someone's word and you haven't got CCTV, physical injuries, witness statements from neighbours, etc., you can't take that forward. I get it. But that's not, that system is flawed because you're relying on somebody who's already living through like 10 years of abuse to save text messages, to take pictures of every injury they've ever received. Like if they're a victim of coercive control and they're going through their phone, they're not going to have time to do that. They're not thinking about, oh, I should save that abusive email because that'll come in handy when I pop along to the CPS, especially if they've had crap experiences of the CPS, which a lot of times, or like not the CPS necessarily, but like police and the criminal justice system in general, that's what happens. So it's kind of, I think in a sense, very big aim or wish is that in a sense we kind of need to scrap everything in a sense and start again. I think we need to try and take away a lot of our preconceptions and already existing ideas and lenses around data and collection and reporting and all of this, and go, actually, what can we do this? And as has been pointed out in the chat, like 1% of rapes are like found a conviction stuff, and it's like, yeah, of course, because our systems don't work. So we're not getting DNA data in time. There's too much emphasis on DNA data, for example. People do not feel comfortable. People don't feel included in spaces. Like, I mean, I could waffle on for ages. I know we're tight on time, but I took a survivor to the police station because they reported an incident to me in person, and they'd been endured this incident for about 2 weeks, and this was their first opportunity to escape. So they came, and I was sort of the first responder to this incident, so I took them to the police station. Now, I'd already done stuff like this in the past, but even I, as someone who's had experience with the criminal justice system, was blown away by how we get into the police station, we're in a public waiting room. They have to disclose everything to somebody over the reception counter for everyone to hear. And then we are assigned to an officer. Officer doesn't even give us their name. So then they have to recount the entire story again because the notes were not passed on. After that, we were then given to another officer for them to take an official statement. By this point, my client nearly walked out the room because that other officer wanted the whole thing again. And because it was the police, they wanted it in chronological order with dates, times, details of offences. They were there for like 6 to 8 hours. And then they had to come back in the next day, half the day, to go over their statement and sign it, And now I was told that because I've made a statement in support of them, that my client and I can no longer talk about the details of the case because we've got to go to court. And it was that, and it's just like, why do how that the course no one's going to come forward, and of course that's never going to happen. So how are you ever going to get the data on that case? That was a very long answer. I do apologise, but yeah.
No, thank you, Astrid, and the point is well made. We have to get better at working with all victims, and in the chat there's lots of conversation that basically say the needs of all victims need to be addressed, and it's bad for LGBT plus people, just as it's bad for other victims, and the system is not working. So the next question, which actually, Astrid, I will start off with you, is how can trans people be supported in fleeing or reporting domestic abuse? So you've touched on this, when they often have good reasons to doubt whether a refuge is a safe space for them. Maybe you don't need to answer that last bit because clearly we've talked about refuges, but what is it that we need to do differently as commissioners, as criminal justice leaders, to make fleeing or reporting domestic abuse easier, safer for trans and non-binary people?
Oh gosh, I think make us feel like we're included in the conversation to begin with, I suppose, because again, and I appreciate I just want to name some of the sentiments in the chat around feeling disheartened, which I can completely understand, and I really don't want it to come across like it's kind of all doom and gloom and it's awful. But I think it's a valid part of the conversation, because like I, as a trans person, do not feel reflected in Vogue. I feel disheartened when I read Women's Aid basically shitting on my community and my existence, and the frontline service that myself and my colleague deliver. Like, not to toot our own horns, but we do some amazing work, and I'm sure that everybody else in this room does some really like back-breaking amazing work, but then to be met with statements like that, it's like, well, actually, what's the point? So how can trans and non-binary people feel supported and encouraged? So I think feel like they belong in the conversation, feel like they're seen and they're affirmed by their commissioners, their local authorities and the services. And I think there needs to be a recognition within an individual agency. So say, for example, Sussex Police, well, I'll say Sussex Police, the police in general, need to understand that like the importance of correct pronouns, naming somebody, gendering people correctly, the bare minimum. But I'm receiving multiple police reports where people are being misgendered. Now, if a client reads that, they're never going to report. I think a lot of our systems are very like arduous and strenuous, and don't always lead to great outcomes, which can be quite challenging. Yeah, I think we've talked about refuge provision and accommodation. I think a lot of times it's like we've talked about emergency accommodation, but you know, the benefits of leaving have to outweigh the costs. I think it's kind of what it comes down to for me. And for a lot of people, and particularly trans non-binary people, the benefits of leaving are less, because whilst they're stuck in an abusive relationship, that household might be one of their places of safety. It might be affordable. It might be a place that they are allowed to present as the gender that they wish to present as. It might not be, but actually it might be safer than going into a mixed gender, mixed need hostel or accommodation where they could be met with violence, transphobia, homophobia, or actually if they do leave, they can't take anything with them. Like I've got clients who are stuck in, they're paying service charges for places that actually should be paying them to even live there because they're naff. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's like you're putting a plaster on a fracture. It's just terrible. But I think, yeah, we're not doing enough of that DA awareness and education. The stuff we're seeing in the media is violence against women and girls, is like transphobic turf narrative, and we're barely getting it right for like cisgender heterosexual survivors. We're definitely not getting it right for anybody else. So actually, how do we feel like if we leave, we're going to be taken seriously, we're going to be believed, we're going to be accepted, and then there's going to be somewhere for us to go? Because there's not even refuges for kind of LGBT people in Brighton and Hove. We have an LGBT refuge, but it's a dispersed project that has like 3 units. That's nowhere near enough. So how the hell is anyone going to think, I identify with that narrative, I see it as correct, and like see it as applicable to me, because I think oftentimes kind of queer is synonymous with lesser, and then that actually this feels like a realistic and tangible thing. If I go to someone, they're going to believe me, I can get out, there's going to be a safe place for me to go, and I can live my life. Like I wouldn't want to go into a refuge, like I wouldn't want to flee, because actually the benefits of, you know, if I was in a situation like that, there'd be so many, probably, I doubt going into somewhere like Percival Terrace or wherever in Brighton and Hove would be a safe space for me.
Thank you. Leni, you must have lots of experience of this through your work. What do you think that some good practice might be? How do we encourage more trans people to feel safe?
I don't think that trans people feel safe right now.
No.
I don't think trans people feel safe right now. And I don't think that this is about, I don't think this is an easy fix. And I think that we need to start being really realistic about what needs to go into moving us from where we are now, which is, you know, an awful place for the trans communities in this country, to a place where there might be some modicum of safety and sense of safety. You know, we know the disproportionate effects on trans and non-binary communities of abuse and violence across the board. And we know that there is a real, true lack of safe places that they can go and feel confident in going to, you know. And Astrid quite rightly brought up the recent Women's Aid statement during this conversation. And I would just like to flag that, you know, that statement starts by saying the violence against women and girls sector has been built over many years by women and girls for women and girls. I just want to remind everybody that some of those women and girls were trans women. Yeah, some of those women and girls were non-binary people. You know, there have been staff, volunteers, people using those services since they were first conceived that have been members of the trans and non-binary community. And there is an awful conflation narrative between trans and non-binary people and perpetrators. You know, there was a a guide put out by an agency that I will not name, a statutory agency, not a third sector agency. And I'm not tarring all women's aids or women's sector organisations to the same brush. I know that there are some great examples of trans and non-binary inclusion in some women's services. I'm not saying it's everybody, but I am saying that the narrative is very, very difficult, and that if the broad narrative is that there are women and there are trans and non-binary people, then trans and non-binary people are going to feel much less confident in coming forward to any of those services, even those ones that are genuinely trans and non-binary inclusive and want to be doing that work as they have always done. But this agency put out a guide, the statutory agency put out a guide that talked about lesbian, gay and bi victims and trans victims and perpetrators. And, you know, we need to be aware that these are some of the narratives that are happening. You know, obviously we work with a significant number of LGBT plus, not LGBT plus, obviously I only work with LGBT plus people, a significant number of trans and non-binary people. We see every day the things that trans and non-binary people in this country are going through, and the lack of options that there are for them to safely exit those situations, as Astrid has much more eloquently said than me. And I think that, you know, it is all very well and good saying that there are, and I would say questionable when you think about risk, reasons why same-sex services might be a thing that some people think are necessary. But I do not see the funding coming in to roll out LGBT plus or trans and non-binary equivalent services that make up for the gap. And my question will always be, and I think I've said this over and over again this evening, where are those people going to go? I think everybody in that conversation recognizes that trans and non-binary people are victims of abuse and violence, and are victims of really extreme forms of abuse and violence in many cases. But the philosophical conversation does not match what is actually happening in commissioning, and giving that alternative place for people to go. And I think that's, without that, how do you gain any kind of sense of safety if you're saying this door's closed, but we're not opening another one?
Thank you, Leni. Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with Leni more, and I absolutely couldn't agree with Astrid more in terms of my trans and non-binary brothers and sisters are not safe. There's no element, you know, there's no argument for me about that. I've really struggled as the chief exec of an organisation supporting male, trans and non-binary victims of sexual abuse, my fellow survivors. I've struggled because on a number of occasions, I've been asked if my organisation can support some trans women. And my initial response has been no, because we're a male service.
Absolutely.
However, we have ended up, and I need to be very careful here not to identify people, but for a couple of cases, the individuals, the survivors, were identified by the criminal justice system as their assigned gender at birth, due to the fact that when they were abused, it was in childhood. The difficult thing for me as a leader in this sector is to kind of say, well, I'm really happy to support because the survivors are survivors to me. But there is something about, if I say yes, then that means I'm not seeing who you are.
Exactly.
If I say no, you're not getting a service. So what we've done, and we will continue to do this until, as Leni says, the money comes through and there is other provision, or we work out a way of doing this. And I don't have the answer, and I know that many of my fellow leaders in this sector don't have the answer either. But until we do, all I can ever do is take on a case-by-case basis effectively and say to the individuals, you're not welcome here. However, and this is the reason why, however, if you feel that this is okay for you to be here, then you are more than welcome here. And I'll say one thing as well, that the trans women and trans men that have accessed our service and sat in groups with cisgendered heterosexual males have never had a problem. Never had a problem. Contrary to popular belief, never had a single problem.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm just wondering if Nicholas has got a contribution to make on this item. I just wondered what the opportunities of your role as a member of the London Assembly are here in challenging the Met, challenging the Mayor about what their provision is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Alison. I mean, some really powerful contributions. So thank you to the other panelists. As you say, Alison, my experience is London. I'm looking at the Met Police, and we're having a discussion with the Met Police about technology, and they said, oh, and one of them said, technology, we feel like the Met sometimes is 10 years behind. And I thought, well, technology, unfortunately, is not the only area where the Met Police is behind. But I do see some signs that that they are becoming more aware of the scale of the challenge. The Stephen Port murders, for example, have driven change in the Met Police. It's still not clear exactly where that's going, but for example, they brought in 160 LGBT plus advisors across the Met Police. The role is, and maybe Leni, I don't know if you've interacted with these people, but the role is a bit opaque. But I think if it's developed, it could address some of the things, Astrid, that you were talking about, the experience of trans people going into a police station, actually reporting these issues, how it actually is like to live through that. And I would hope that that those advisors would offer guidance and challenge policy, challenge accepted practice within the Met. I do wonder if a lot of this goes back to actually the discussion we were having previously about data. And if we can improve data and fix that problem to highlight the scale of the challenge that trans people face, then it becomes a more manageable task for, I guess, policy influencers like me, policy makers like Alison, to make the cases for the services that we need to commission. I mean, I started this by saying I was a bit of a geek when it comes to transport. I'm also a bit of a geek when it comes to data, and I think a lot of stuff does come back to having the right data so you can make the right case.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And on that note, I'm going to conclude today's session. Thank you so much for coming to the LGBT plus Commission session on LGBT plus hate crime, domestic abuse and sexual violence. I'm really sorry if we were unable to cover your point today. However, the research team is going to be in contact to gather your points and case studies in the coming week. And we're very keen to hear your examples of best practice and the policy recommendations that you have. So we would be very grateful if you could submit these. And if you've got any questions or thoughts for the Commission, please do get in touch at info@chamberuk.com, and I'll put that into the chat so that you don't forget, info@chamberuk.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I hope that today is the start of the changes that we would all like to see in the response to LGBT plus hate crime, domestic abuse and sexual violence. Thank you very much.